Welcome to Hollywood Remixed, a topical podcast about inclusion and representation in culture and entertainment. I'm Rebecca Sun, Senior Editor of Diversity and Inclusion at The Hollywood Reporter. Here on our show, each episode is dedicated to a single theme that is centered around characters, identities, or storylines that have traditionally been excluded or misrepresented in mainstream culture. This week, in honor of one of my favorite shows, Dear White People, whose fourth and final season is dropping on Netflix today, we're dedicating the episode to Black college stories. I'm delighted to have Logan Browning, who stars on Dear White People as Sam, join us later to talk about how this series has represented a diverse range of perspectives and backgrounds among its student body. She'll also share a little bit about her own college journey. But first, we'll take a walk, a campus tour, if you will, through Hollywood's history of Black-centered college movies and TV shows. In researching this subject, I was very much guided by a column written by the late critic Roland Laird for Pop Matters in 2011. I'll link to his work in the transcript to this episode, which you can find at thr.com, and on my Twitter thread for this episode, which will be at the Rebecca Sun. To accompany me on the tour and add even more dimension to our discussion about college experiences for Black students, I'm happy to welcome yet another THR colleague to Hollywood Remixed. Evan Nicole Brown just joined The Hollywood Reporter earlier this month as our culture writer. She was most recently a New York Times Fellow and has written for Fast Company, Atlas Obscura, and Bushwick Daily. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always nice to talk to a colleague, especially a new one, and get to have a chance to actually kind of talk face to face.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be discussing this with you.
So, with today's topic, when we were pre-gaming to really get into the theme prior to hitting record, we discussed the option of going linearly through the history of, various Black screen representations of Black collegiate life, but we decided on instead going topically, and we'll just kind of pull in examples as they go. But first, because I think it's very important when we talk about media to realize that there's no such thing as a viewer who is a blank slate. Everybody approaches a piece of art with the full context of their experiences. So if you don't mind, I'd love to hear about what your college experience was like. You went to Bard, is that right?
Yes. That's correct. And being a born and raised Angelino, going to a small liberal arts school on the East Coast in New York's Hudson Valley was a totally different experience from the urban and very diverse environment I grew up in. So yeah, in terms of being a Black student at Bard, there was definitely a cohort of us. We were not at all in the majority. But I think that really it sort of became important to find certain affinity groups and to find interest areas that could connect me with other students, both beyond my race, but also within my own Blackness, because finding those corners of the campus on my own, it became very apparent to me the second I got on campus that wasn't going to be immediately available if I didn't look for it myself. So yeah, in terms of social life, I would say that it was very privileged and white for the most part. And I was familiar with that, having gone to Harvard Westlake High School in Los Angeles, actually. But at the same time, there was definitely a yearning I felt all 4 years for just sort of the house parties with people of color that I grew up going to. And that was really my safe space and my comfort zone. So just sort of finding a way to be myself while also code switching as sort of a survival skill, I guess you could say, that really guided my college experience.
I think the first thing, whenever we're talking about the subject of sort of like the Black collegiate experience, that grouping very specifically, has a delineation. There's the HBCU experience, right? Historically Black college and universities. And then there's PWI, which is a term that I learned after HBCU. PWI, for those who don't know, predominantly white institutions. That's the kind of school you went to. It's basically everything that isn't an HBCU. Like I went to a PWI, although I don't know. I was actually trying to think, I was like, what's the closest to like a historically Asian college or university? And I could only come up with UC Irvine.
I love that. Yes.
That's an in-joke for it, right? The University of
right.
Civics and Integras, right? Yeah. So that's an in-joke. So anyways, so that's a very different experience. There's been a good number of depictions of HBCU life over the years, and a different world, was, I think, for many, much of the general public, their first exposure to really what that was like for those who didn't attend HBCUs. That was the late 80s. I know that predates your life, Evan, but that sitcom was really seminal. I mean, it influenced. I mean, Lena Waithe named her production company Hillman Grad after the fictional HBCU, Hillman College. In that School Daze, Spike Lee's sophomore feature, pun intended, took place again on a fictional HBCU. Spike Lee is a very proud HBCU grad, Morehouse College. And then going through movies like Drumline, things like that sort of really depicted the proud legacy of that. However, I'm just curious, actually, before I go on, did you ever, when you were looking at colleges, was that part of, I don't want to imply that every Black high school student thinks, should I go to an HBCU? But just curious about whether or not that was an option for you.
It was. I did apply to Howard and I got in. I decided to go to Bard instead. I was going to mention this earlier, and I think I could have had equally beautiful experiences at both places in different ways and for different reasons. But I was really attracted to Bard's literature program, which is what I ended up majoring in. So I always knew that I was choosing my program and the education I was going to get at Bard more than the community. I knew that I was going to lose something and let something go in that way by choosing a school like Bard over an HBCU like Howard. So that's something I negotiated with myself at age 18 and sort of made that choice that way. But I have several friends who have gone through the HBCU system. My grandfather and my uncle are both Morehouse men. So it's very much, it was always in my universe, and still is. But yeah, just kind of went the other direction.
and also even that decision process then, right? For some, I'm not Black, I don't have a Black family, but being able to see that decision process, should I go to an HBCU or should I go to a PWI, depicted, I think was it Blackish? They had a storyline when Zoe was graduating from high school and looking at college searches. So that's been kind of great to be able to get to see characters wrestle with, like you said, there are pros and cons. There are things that you give up from your college experience, and also maybe, if I'm not being too presumptuous, burdens that you take on in deciding to go to a PWI.
Yes. It's a trade-off that really never ends, even in life. I feel like we're constantly making those selections in places in environments we show up in, and different decisions and workplaces and things like that we have to choose between as well. So I guess in that way it's a good practice to go through that as a teenager when you're making that college decision. But
absolutely. And so let's talk about then the PWI, the different experiences that come into play. And so just to give people some examples of shows that depict the experience of Black students in PWI. One, of course, is Dear White People. That's very central. That decision is very, very central to the experience of the ensembles, both in the film and the television version of Dear White People. I think Zoe ultimately ends up going to a PW. Zoe from Blackish ultimately goes to a PWI because I think Grownish is a multiracial school, I think. And also John, this is another film that is a little bit older, but John Singleton's Higher Learning, from 1995, kind of goes into some of the tragic consequences of the racial clash, the racial tensions that can take place. Let's start with, I'm very curious about class and privilege, since you mentioned that. And I think that has, that's something you can speak with, incorporating your personal experience. You kind of alluded to a little bit that there's a kind of a perception of what people think when they think of a Black student at a university. And that's definitely, that is not necessarily reflective of the reality. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I was very going into college, I was very cognizant of my privilege as an upper middle class Black woman who had gone to a major private high school in Los Angeles. I think that it isolated me from some Black students in college because there was definitely a difference in lived experience and in access to certain experiences and certain rooms and certain types of people in some ways. But at the same time, I saw very clearly how it made white students more comfortable with me because they felt that there was this sort of immediate common ground just through knowing maybe the name of the high school I had gone to or hearing the way I spoke, and just sort of like, I think there's just so many different sort of cues that are really sort of invisible, but that work that are used very insidiously in ways sort of on accident by people to signal that they feel more comfortable with you than somebody else or otherwise. And the thing that's really difficult about that is that it's really, I feel like the onus isn't really on the person in that space to sort of explain things away, but it kind of ends up feeling that way because you wanna feel at home with your own group of people, and you want to have that common ground, and you do in many ways. But at the same time, I feel like there were certain ways in which I was comfortable with other students and white students on campus who maybe shared a different experience with me outside of race. So just like constantly navigating that. But I think that definitely from the high school I went to, a place like Bard, and even to be completely honest, a small liberal arts school like Bard, I think truthfully was seen as almost like a surprise for me to go to. Really, it would have been an expectation for me to go to an Ivy League. So even just navigating all of those sort of like unspoken things was really interesting. But I definitely struggled with feeling like I wanted to really be a part of the Black community at Bard. And I was to a certain degree, but I think that like my class privilege eliminated some of that understanding. And so that was like something I was constantly trying to approach positively and get better at, and just like remain very conscious of my privilege and to not be sensitive surrounding those types of like divisions.
That's something that I think, and again, so we're speaking to the difference between the stereotype, which like I went to Duke, so it's another like school that's considered, a good school. And like you would hear, like there's just this assumption like that the Black students are either like they're on an athletic scholarship or they're on some other sort of scholarship. And although, there are all sorts of students, and yes, many students who come from historically excluded populations who are there on scholarship, that's not necessarily the case. When I was doing research for this episode, I saw that because of what you just spoke of, the disparity between the stereotype and your lived experience, that there have been certain characters then that I'm curious whether would especially resonate. One of the earliest being, and again, I recognize this show is before your time, Whitley from A Different World. Even though A Different World is set at an HBCU, she was the OG, and I'm using this, I'm borrowing this from, there was a great story in The Undefeated a few years ago, the original Bad and Bougie lady, she was somebody who came from generational wealth, very light-skinned, which we'll talk about too, Jasmine Guy, and originally kind of painted as the villain. I think the sort of the first season of I'm just going to give a history lesson here for those who don't know or remember. First season of A Different World, not successful. People hated the show. People hated Whitley. She was like a snob, the light-skinned, rich snob, at this school. And then, and then it changed. Debbie Allen came on board. The show, behind the scenes, the show finally got some Black creators, some people who went to an HBCU. Debbie Allen took the writing staff to visit Spelman and Howard and all these schools to be like, look, we got to get this right. Anyways, the show got a lot better. People ended up, at loving Whitley and that character. But I'm curious, growing up, did you have any representations of Black girls who were like you, who were in an environment like you, or did you not?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that in truth, I think the truth really lies somewhere sort of like in the gap between those two opposites. And that's certainly my experience. I feel like I've actually been sort of blessed with the best of both worlds and feel very comfortable in sort of more like bad and bougie generational wealth spaces, but also like in spaces that are less affluent and more underserved. And so like, in that way, I don't think I really had representation. And I still think actually there's a lack of that representation in terms of somebody who can flow quite easily between both or multiple spaces. But the closest thing that I can think of right now is I do think that like, especially as an Angelino, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was like definitely kind of spoke to that contrast in terms of like Will coming from West Philly and moving into this mansion in Bel-Air. But I think that just seeing like those characters navigate very preppy spaces and sort of have to apologize for their class privilege in certain ways, and then in other episodes be totally ignorant of how privileged they were. I think that The Fresh Prince did a really good job at showing that. And also, I think on one hand, it's actually very important, and I think that we, in terms of Hollywood depictions of Black life, that's not to say that, you know, I'm thinking also of like shows like The Cosby Show and Fresh Prince too, but just like seeing that depiction, especially at the time, I think was important. Even though it didn't show all sides of the Black experience, I think that up until that point, there had been a lot of negative stereotypes that still persist about like, I don't know, just the crack epidemic in Los Angeles, or just like certain depictions of like low income communities, hoods and neighborhoods and gang violence. That was a lot of what people were seeing about Black life and about Black schools. So even though shows showing the sort of like more like bougie, affluent, upper middle class, out of touch, Black person, Black woman, you know, they didn't do a great job at showing nuance all the time. But I also think that like in terms of the sort of timeline of representation, they played a really important role because we needed to sort of see that type of lifestyle to do some work to sort of overcome the negative stereotypes that were dominating Hollywood.
Let's talk about like code switching. It's half a survival mechanism, but I think it's also like kind of the beautiful side of it. Like I kind of like code switching. I like knowing a different language. You know, whether we're speaking like where we speak literally or like figuratively a different language, a different cultural language.
Yes, and I do have to say, to your point about code switching, like I'm thinking of the movie Drumline, which was like, I loved it growing up and it was huge in my circle of friends, just like seeing that HBCU experience, and like Nick Cannon was so major at the time, and just like seeing like all the fun surrounding like that sort of experience. It's really interesting because I think, to be honest, I've at times felt a certain sort of jealousy that, you know, students at HBCUs don't have to code switch and get to live a more fully authentic life in that way in class, on campus. So I think that that's something that like seeing those types of like college depictions through the years has really made clear to me, is that like I think it would have been a beautiful safe haven to not feel forced to code switch quite as much. But at the same time, there's still, everybody's different. Whether you're in a Black institution or not, everybody switches, you know, how they behave in the classroom versus not. So I guess that in that sense, it's similar. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, I'm glad that you brought something up in terms of just like learning about the appeal of HBCUs through media, because sometimes people, like in your case, you had family who had gone to HBCUs, but for those who don't, it's like honestly like media is one of the most important ways in which you can sort of recruit and promote. I found an old article from the New York Times where there was I think it was a university president, Walter Kimbrough, who said that spanning from the time in which Cosby Show first hit the air in 1984 to the end of A Different World, which was a spinoff of the Cosby Show in 1993, HBCU enrollment grew by 24.3%. And then after that show went off the air, it dropped, which outpaced enrollment at like general universities in general. But then in like the decade after A Different World went off the air, that HBCU enrollment rate or the growth rate dropped to 9.2%, right? So that's a drastic drop off.
That's interesting. And I love that point about how like those sorts of percentages are really guided by the cultural moment, because, you know, for instance, I think for my grandparents' generation, you know, who were born in the early part of the 20th century and like around the Great Depression, for Black people at that time, it was so important, honestly, in a lot of circles, to actually preach assimilation and to like get your children into institutions that would legitimize them, quote unquote, and give them a better life and allow them to secure more generational wealth. So I think it's interesting that like we went through that time period. And then, as you say, like in the 80s and 90s, like there was definitely a push to like, for various reasons in society, you know, historically, but like, I think that there was an interest in finding our common ground and really preaching the beauty of brotherhood and sisterhood through historically Black colleges and universities, through like Greek life, and sort of banding together in that way. So, and now again, I mean, I can't say for sure, but I feel like given the racial reckoning, given the all too obvious lack of progress in terms of police brutality and just other microaggressions and just violences that, you know, people are still going through, I think that I wouldn't be surprised to see, you know, us turn the corner again on some of those enrollment percentages and statistics. And I think that like Black people are looking for opportunities like HBCUs again to really just focus on our community and build up our strength amongst each other, because I think it's like really obvious at this time that that's where a lot of the power is going to come from. And it's not to say that going to a PWI means you're a sellout or that you're not aligned with your people, but I think it's more and more, it's less important now to sort of whatever social capital is gained from going to a PWI, I feel like that's becoming less and less important, and sort of like retaining culture is more so.
Absolutely. And I think we saw that sort of that trade-off that you spoke of at the very beginning of our conversation play out in part with what was happening with Nicole Hannah-Jones, right? When she had her tenure, her tenureship was questioned by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. If you guys don't know about this, just Google it. It's too complex of an issue for me to summarize quickly. But she ultimately decided to take her talents to Howard University. And in part, that was just in realizing the utter lack of support, administrative support, board of trustees support that she would have gotten at UNC, which is like insane it's like if Nicole Hannah-Jones, one of the most esteemed and acclaimed and awarded, you know, academics and journalists in the industry is treated that way, like what hope is there for the rest of us?
And I think that's unfortunately, it's a really poignant example of how no matter what institution has accepted you, a place like the New York Times, the Pulitzer Center, like with all of those things on your CV, at the end of the day, you're still a Black woman. And she was, I feel like University at UNC
Chapel Hill.
Chapel Hill.
It was so UNC of them.
Yeah, sorry. No,
I was a Duke.
Oh, yeah. I love that. No, but I think that was a really, really obvious display of how no matter whether you go to an HBCU or a PWI or whether you work at a smaller local paper or a major news organization, Blackness is still at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. And that's what she was being challenged on at the end of the day. It really wasn't about her credentials. It was really about her race. And like, I think that just goes to show that, you know, we still have a ways to go in terms of like, no matter how you slice it, representation is symbolic in a lot of ways. And it's not necessarily indicative of true progress.
That's such a good point. Exactly. I think that's as we go into, I think that this conversation about DEI is we're past that first chapter now where we're just talking about like get a face on screen or, you know, get them in the room. And it's about like how you actually think of these people, how you're actually are valuing their labor and their contributions, which is a much more subtle thing, you know. So in a way, it becomes even harder to to really get that right. I want to wrap on something that you were starting to talk about with the value of HBCUs and how media can really help promote them, actually, because your own decision, right? You had to make a trade-off, what your experience was going to be like versus a school with a really, really great program, a very legitimate choice. And I've been learning about how, a lot of times HBCUs, I think it doesn't come to any surprise, are chronically under-resourced. And so as a result, many, Black high school students have to face that choice of the experience. Do I take the microaggressions with the quality of this academic offering or with the quality of this athletic program, And so and so lately we've been seeing sort of like you said, I think a commitment to invest, and it's come from some folks like Chris Paul, who I interviewed him at the beginning of the year, and he was he was producing an ESPN Plus docuseries about a basketball team at HBCUs. And Chris Paul, so I'm a big ACC person because again I went to college in the ACC. Chris Paul went to Wake Forest, a PWI. But now he's going back to finish his undergrad degree at an HBCU. And he was saying how one of the reasons why he had to choose Wake Forest was because, again, there are all these talented Black, athletic prospects who go on to play for predominantly white institutions because that's where the resources are. And how can we reverse that, right? It's the most ironic talent drain, right, that exists, because all of these PWIs, these athletic programs, are making so much money off of Black athletic phenoms, right? And so we started to see that reverse a tiny bit. There were some very prominent, sorry, this is devolving into a sports podcast. There's some very prominent, Black prospects who declared for Howard and for other HBCU programs. So that's moving, as well as general philanthropists. I think Mackenzie Scott, who used to be married to Jeff Bezos, has made significant gifts I'm sorry, it's transformative is what Howard University called it, $40 million to Howard. That kind of investment really, really matters. And it allows, and it's not about saying that everybody should go to an HBCU, but I think it's about choice. Right.
I think that's a great point. And I know that historically there were many more HBCUs that many of them have closed down, or sort of enrollment has gotten so low because of the things you speak of that, the choices became more and more limited, and to the point where you mostly hear about the Spelman, the Howard, the Morehouse. So I think just, building up a more robust network of HBCUs, and again, giving more students, helping students feel like they have more choice, because if you can get financial aid at a PWI, and there's less of that opportunity at an HBCU, that really can make the difference for a lot of people making that choice. So, yeah, absolutely. Well, we always close with two very, very simple questions that I've now basically merged into one question because I realize that that's what the guests want. But it's basically, is there either something, thinking along this theme, is there a TV show or a movie that you would say ooh, that depiction needs a do-over, it was problematic, or is there something that you would recommend? Again, thinking about our theme, a narrative that you think people should check out if they want to see something done right? Wow, that's a great question.
I can go first if you want to think about it a little
Yes,
bit.
Please.
Okay. So it's not my place to call out whatever was problematic. There's probably a lot of minor things too, just, side characters over the years. But I don't know. I think that the spirit of this theme isn't so much there are tropes within it, but I think that when you think about Black collegiate narratives, you mostly think about the stories that are centered on that. I'll do two that are kind of maybe a little bit easy. Okay, one is for people who haven't had an opportunity to see Dear White People, I love this show, and obviously the rest of the episode is dedicated to it, so it's obviously not a hidden gem. but it's so good at depicting the microcosm, like the tribes in college, the varied experiences of people, like, you know, all of the main characters in the ensemble are Black. They could not be more different from each other, like in perspective, and it's very nuanced. It's a super fun show to watch. I really, really love it. I think it really it does what a great TV show based on a movie does, which is it just expands the universe, you know, and gives you more. I like that. But I'll also say on the unscripted side, since I mentioned it, Chris Paul's docuseries, Why Not Us? It's on ESPN Plus, and it just follows a real basketball team, you know, from an HBCU that I think it was North Carolina Central, which is trying to, it kind of had a pivotal season because it takes place during the pandemic, which was like, it was hard on, I mean, everybody suffered during the pandemic, but an HBCU who has to deal with like their seasons being canceled was kind of catastrophic. Is catastrophic for Howard as well. So those are two options.
Nice. Yes. For me, I would say I really Stomp the Yard, which came out in 2007, is about like street dancing, but also like going to a fraternity, enrolling in a fraternity sort of like step group and using sort of a natural dance talent in that way to sort of like make oneself more of a, just like pursue that more seriously. And the reason I say Stomp the Yard is honestly because not only is it a movie that like sticks out in my mind as being, it just feels very authentic, actually. I feel like it was well done in terms of authenticity. I feel like I absolutely know people like the ones I saw on screen in that film. It wrestled with a lot of like different emotional like challenges, socioeconomic challenges. But I think what I love about it too is that dancing and the rhythm of the drums, like even stemming back to like the cultural history of African drums in our culture. Like I think that celebrating dance and movement and the way that was portrayed in that movie actually was really kind of profound. Like at face value, it kind of was just like, oh, like a fun dance movie. But I actually think that the ability to see Black joy in the midst of Black struggle was really like significant to me. In terms of a do-over, honestly, I don't know if this is exactly answering your question, but I'm gonna throw it out there. I would actually like to see a film like A Legally Blonde, which like has so many, you know, has become such an iconic film about like femininity and feminism and the college experience and, you know, sort of like bimboism, but also like being very smart and intellectual and like not being properly understood. I would like to see a Black woman in a lead role like Reese Witherspoon was in that movie. I think that actually that could be a really thematically what Legally Blonde represents. I think if rendered in Black, it would be really, really powerful. And I actually can't think of an example of that type of college movie and like a young woman navigating those sorts of like nuances in terms of like being really attractive and sort of resting on that, but at the same time really caring about school and her career. Not many examples come to mind. So I think that, yeah, being done, a Black version of that type of film would actually be really great to see.
That's great. That's a good pitch. I mean, honestly, because you're right. Like it upends a long-held stereotype and a trope, and kind of like subverts our ideas of what like smart people should look like and act like and be about and care about. So yeah, I would like to see that. Well, you heard it here first, guys. If that adaptation ever comes to pass.
Right.
Evan, this was really fun to talk to you. Thank you so much. I hope you come back again.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for having me. This was great.
Logan Browning stars on Dear White People as Samantha White, the biracial documentary film student whose campus radio show Dear White People is often in the middle of many of the cultural and social incidents that take place at Winchester University, an Ivy League-like predominantly white institution with an active Black student caucus. Logan's other starring credits include Bratz the movie, Tyler Perry's Meet the Browns, and VH1's Hit the Floor. Logan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I have binged a lot of different shows during the pandemic, and Dear White People was clearly one of the best choices I made. It's fantastic. Very, very dense. Lots to talk about.
I'm so glad. I'm glad that made it on your watch list. I had a lot of things that, maybe weren't as dense. I watched the Tiger, Carol Baskin.
Tiger King.
Tiger King.
Tiger King.
Actually, it is kind of dense.
It's pretty dense. It gets pretty dark. I actually did not finish Tiger King. My first pandemic watch was Love is Blind. And then I was like, if this pandemic goes much longer, I don't know if I can do all I need to.
Love is Blind is so good. They have
it?
a second season. I'm obsessed. I love them so much. I need to know where they're going. They're such a great show.
I haven't watched that reunion. Yeah, the 1 year later. I haven't watched that one yet, but I was like, I can't get sucked back into it. But either way, in between my Love is Blind viewings, I watched all three, released seasons of Dear White People. Very worthwhile for anybody who has not yet had the pleasure. But anyways, since we have you here and since this episode is dedicated to stories about Black college life, I wanted to start by asking you about your own experience, if that's cool. I believe you spent a year at Vanderbilt before you moved to LA. Is that right?
Yeah. So I moved to LA when I was a kid, actually. So I moved to LA when I was 14, and then I was an actor professionally from 14 to about 17, went back to Georgia, came back to LA, filmed Bratz the movie. Then I went to college. And then that's when I went to Vanderbilt. And I stayed there for a year. And then my manager at the time was like, you should come back because you just did this film and you should build off of it. So I took a leave of absence, which I didn't know you could do. But I tell a lot of young people who are always like, I'm going to take a gap year. I say, just go for the first year because it's so much harder to get back into school after you've left it, like just from a application standpoint. So yeah, I took a leave of absence.
That's a really good point. I feel like I know obviously a lot of, I went to a school with a really good basketball program. So we had a lot of like athletes who do that, right? They did, 1 to 3 years. And then many of them now are like finishing, up their degrees because you kind of need to seize that time, right? Seize that moment while you have it. I'm curious, if you don't mind, why did you pick Vanderbilt?
Oh, I come from a family of academics, and my father went to Emory and Earlham and Harvard. He was a dentist. And it was just from very young, going to a top 20 school was very important to me and my family. And so for me, I told my dad that was going to have to be top 20 academics and top 20 party and top 20 sports. I needed the collegiate experience. I looked at Cornell, I looked at Carnegie Mellon. But Vandy from the outside looking in, when I first visited, it was a beautiful campus. It seemed to have everything that I wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great school. And, in the first half of this podcast episode, one of the things we talked about is how, we've seen this, in some shows, but certainly in real life, one big decision that some Black college-bound students face when they're looking at going to college is whether to go to an HBCU or a PWI, a predominantly white institution, like the school I went to, like Vandy, like Winchester University. I'm just curious if that's something that you thought about. Was that anything that was on your radar?
It's so fascinating to me because it was on my radar, but I grew up in Atlanta. So Atlanta has like Spelman and Morehouse, and Atlanta is very Black. And the middle school, elementary school, high school I went to were very Black. It had a mix of everyone, but I never saw a lack of myself around. And so I don't think that I had this inclination to go to a HBCU. And I think that I do think my parents kind of steered me into the direction of like, well, okay, like HBCUs exist, but also, the world is not all Black, and maybe you will have a more realistic entry into the world by going to any, a school that has whatever the world has. However, in hindsight, all of my friends and contemporaries who went to HBCUs got an experience, I think, that was incredibly valuable, because when you are all Black, when you're all kind of the same thing, you then just get to be yourselves. You get to just focus on being great, and you get to learn more about yourself. You get to, explore so many topics that you don't have it available at a regular school, or especially a PWI. So I definitely think that not going to an HBCU was an experience I missed. However, I also loved going to Vandy. I thought, I found, we had a Black student union at Vandy. I found my people there. And we were able to do the same thing on a smaller level.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that. And that's so true, that what you said about, sometimes with PWIs or schools that are multiracial is that, then you kind of become identified by whatever your demographic is rather than being an individual. We see that on screen sometimes with, college set narratives. And I love college stories because they're like microcosms of the outside world, right? There's so many different factions, interacting with each other, colliding with each other. But sometimes for white-centered narratives, it's like everybody else just gets into every other character is like put into a clique that's just categorized by identity. Like that's the Asian table, or like that's the Black club, and things like that. What I love about Dear White People, one of the things is that even though it's set at a PWI, you have from the very premise of the show, you see such a gradient of perspectives that the Black caucus is separated into factions, and people have different approaches. I mean, I'm curious, is that kind of like what you were talking about, like what it was like for you at Vandy, or even just like in your own life? Like, how do you, like Sam, sort of identify more with the Black Student Union, the BSU approaches, rather than like the COREs or the Black AFs, or like Kelsey's group, African American Student Union.
African American Student Union. I loved all these names. Like you said, the really cool thing about having that Black Student Union and those Black Caucus meetings, having the Black Caucus meetings, were that you got to see that Black people are not monolithic, but in seeing that, you then can deduce that no group is. And no group of people, however you want to identify them, all think exactly the same, or all want to solve a problem or reach a solution the exact same way. And but that everyone should have a seat at the table to discuss and have a meeting of the minds. And at my school, we weren't really like sitting. Okay, our Black Student Union was kind of like just Black Caucus as a whole, but it really wasn't about kind of, it was very different from the show. We kind of more, we had events and, ways to uplift each other. Like, most PWIs, I believe, at least at ours, like we have Black graduation. So we have a separate graduation.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's just a separate Black graduation to give students an opportunity to really shine and to have a separate ceremony, and for your family to really have that moment. Because for Black people, a lot of Black people, graduating college is still a big deal, because we are people who have not started at the same start point as white people in this country. So, and a lot of other, I think, groups of people can identify with that. If you're immigrant, if you're part of a group of people that didn't start at the same line. So, yeah, I think that was kind of what our Black group at Vandy was like. And I think it is similar in other PWIs.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you're talking about, I mean, those issues, like the backgrounds that people come from, I mean, those are when I watched Netflix put up like a 4-minute clip of like everything you missed on Dear. It was like a 4 minutes recapping the first 3 seasons of Dear White People. And even though I watched all 3 seasons of Dear White People, that clip was like too much. There was like too much to pack in. Like, so anyway, that's one of the many, many, many issues that's explored, you know, like the idea of not starting at the same starting point, right? So if you're confused by what Logan just said, just watch the first 3 seasons of Dear White People. And that's one of the things that you'll be educated on. You know, when we talk about representation, again, because there is such a plethora of viewpoints, embodied by the ensemble, and Dear White People at this point has become, I think, a true ensemble, right? Your character Sam is as much of a focal point as we can say there is a focal point on the show, but there's such an ensemble of characters. And I'm wondering if you or your castmates have had encounters with fans that are not just about like, being able to see somebody who looks like them on screen, but have you had experiences with people who are saying, I get to see somebody who thinks the way I do, or who takes a similar approach to life, or who has dealt with a similar type of identity issue, you know, whether it's in school or outside of it. Any sort of engagements or interactions like that?
That's such a great question, and I feel like I feel like maybe there are people out there who I haven't even connected with who have a lot of those feelings. But I do, you know, I was on a walk the other day, ran into one of my neighbors who's, she's in her 40s, she's white woman, she's Jewish, she has 2 kids, and she watched the show just randomly, and she felt like it was very educational, that she learned from it, but she did say that she saw herself in some of the characters, and I think that was the whole point of, you know, Dear White People, is because that's what every other person of every other ethnicity has had to do for so long in Hollywood, which is watch every other character. You know, if I watch Clueless, sometimes maybe I'm seeing myself in Cher and not Dion, or like maybe if I'm watching, or maybe that's a bad example because I did have a Black character to look to, but if maybe, I don't know, I'll use this as an example, Saved by the Bell. If I watch Saved by the Bell, and there's, you know, one Black woman character that's at the high school, do I have to see myself in her? Does that mean that is exactly who I am? Or do I actually, what I ended up doing was choosing which character I felt I wanted to see myself in. But the issue with that is that I feel that the world wants me to be this way. And it was like that with every film, with every television series. But and the other difficult part of that is, if say it's not a Black person, say I'm watching someone who is Asian, is Muslim, is Indian, is ... fill in the blank, then my perception of those people in the world are shaped by that particular image, and that's the only one. And the viewer will inevitably put people in a box based on that particular character, because that's kind of how they showed up. Hopefully, Dear White People is an example of how you can flip something on its head and give everybody else an opportunity to see themselves in any character.
Absolutely. And I think especially even when you just look at the core trio of Black women on the show, and how like Sam and Coco and Joelle, and you can extend it further and talk about Brooke and talk about Kelsey and things like that, but that they, like that dynamic is one of my favorites on the show. Like the sort of, you know, obviously Sam is very close to Joelle, but there's like a frenemies with a history with Coco. And these are 3 very different Black women, and they represent a lot, not just like different philosophies and approaches, but even their backgrounds and their histories are really different. for you, if you don't mind speaking to this, I think, Sam is a biracial character, right? And we see the relationship, and particularly I don't want to spoil people, but Sam has a great relationship with her father, who is white. I'm just curious for you, like, what that experience has been like, playing a biracial character. And I think you've shared this in interviews before, that your parents are both Black, but your biological parents, one parent was white. And how has that has playing Sam sort of like taught you anything about your identity, or maybe the other way around, your own experience has informed how you have played this character for 4 seasons?
It's funny because I almost thought I couldn't relate to Sam in that way, because I am biologically biracial, but I don't identify as biracial. I just don't. And that's something that I'm still kind of working on and trying to uncover and make a decision. I think that everyone gets to make that choice in their life, how they want to identify. But yeah, being raised in a Black home, a Black household, like the images I saw in my home, what we did, the art that we subscribed to, the plays I saw, the music we listened to, the people I was around, it was just all Black all the time. So I never even that. Yeah, like I said, that was the thing. I wondered if I would have a difficult time relating to Sam relating to Sam because I have friends who are biracial and they do identify as biracial. Like if you ask them, or if they're talking in a conversation, they will say, well, as a biracial person, and I've never said that. Or maybe I have, but that's not in, maybe more recently I may have said that. I have no idea. I can't imagine myself saying it, but I just consider myself Black. And I think the thing that Sam has helped me to reckon with is that even though I identify as Black, and that's how I see myself, that the world and what I actually am the world will see me as different. Like the world will see me as this like light-skinned girl with these light green eyes and be like, okay, you are, what are you? The number one question from season 1 of Dear White People, what are you? Which is an awful question. Never ask anyone that. And
especially phrased in that way. Good golly.
It's an ongoing process. I think at the end of the day, the thing it's helped me with is more so like accepting that I am a light-skinned Black woman, and the effects of colorism, and that's separate from being biracial. But yeah, it is complicated, and that's why I have appreciated being able to play Sam on the show, because I have been able to experience some of those complexities through her that I probably never would have on my own, because I never had to reckon with having, growing up in a household with parents from 2 different ethnicities. I never had to deal with that, and I kind of got to live part of that through her, which is kind of strange.
Yeah. So last week's episode of this podcast, we talked about was about this movie Blue Bayou that just came out, and it's about transracial a man who's transracial adopted. He was born in Korea. Biological parents are Korean, but he was raised in Louisiana by white people in the foster system, actually. And your experience is different. You are Black, and you were raised by Black parents. But that aspect, you're right, how the world sees you versus your actual personal upbringing, what that experience is like, I think is a very complex thing that I hope we get to see more stories, exploring more directly. But thank you for answering that question and entertaining it. Before we get to, because I do have some questions about season 4, which, drops today as this podcast episode will drop. So I haven't seen it yet. But thinking back over the three seasons that you guys have filmed, is there an aspect, one of the gazillions of storylines and different issues that you guys have explored, is there one that is really sticks with you as particularly resonant? And it can apply, specifically to this theme of college experience or beyond it, because again, I think Dear White People really was prescient in discussing a lot of things that ended up that the outside world ended up becoming obsessed with.
I think the thing that I've learned and the thing that I will probably take from the show is learning how to, it's compassion and empathy. It's really learning how to have compassion for others, compassion for yourself. And also, so Sam, one of the things I love about her is she is so outspoken. She has no problem saying her truth, and she does it with good intention to protect people. And then sometimes she's wrong. And, I love that she's wrong sometimes and she gets to learn from that and evolve. But it's been interesting, especially as coming out of, 2020 and how the summer was in 2020 and, around the election and just how divided we all were in this country, really the world. I've learned that everyone will be wrong at some point, including ourselves. And if we know that, we are going to have someone tell us how we're wrong, and it may not be a comfortable experience, and we would hope that they would do it with the most compassion possible, shouldn't we also do it to other people? And I think that's the thing that Sam didn't get in the very beginning of Dear White People is, she felt people were wrong and it didn't matter. And she told them exactly how she felt. Now, I'm being a bit hard on her because I do think she came from an emotional place, and I think that it was an honest place. But she was hard on people all the time, and it was important, and it needed to happen. I think that's why she was so emotional, because it was frustrating to have literally be biologically a part of these two different things that are at war. That means that you are at war inside, and you come from the oppressive and the oppressed, and it is soul crushing and just. That in season 1, she has a monologue at the end of episode 1. And I think that is the crux of Sam and the crux of where her pain comes from. And in season 4, as we continue or as you go through all of the seasons, you see the different people that, Sam will become combative with and who will become combative with Sam. And by the end, I think Sam has gotten the opportunity to show what it's like to be compassionate, even when people come for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Sam has definitely had her run-ins and multiple existential crises throughout, the show. I mean, I just remember how relatable it was. What was it? I think you started season 2, basically getting sucked into the whole, arguing with trolls rabbit hole, which was a good cautionary tale, because I definitely had that impulse, and, and then of course, meeting up with Tessa Thompson's character, who was very similar to a real life personality that we don't need to name, but but yeah, fascinating. Gosh, I love the character of Sam Brown. I'm so glad she exists, and in her fullness, in her journey and her flaws. It's just Sam White. Just a beautiful.
I love that. I love that you mixed Logan. You mixed Logan and Sam.
I did.
I love it.
I did. Inextricably tied, but I hope what you would consider a great legacy, because I think she's a good legacy. Okay, season 4. I just have to ask a few questions because I'm so curious. First of all, anybody who's seen the trailer realizes that you guys are going full on musical for this final season. When did your showrunners, when did Justin Simeon and Jacqueline Moore tell you guys that was what you'd be doing?
So, okay, my timeline is a bit off, as I'm sure everyone will excuse, because it was around it was 2020. We were supposed to film in April So you can imagine.
Oh, geez.
You can imagine in March we were like, what's happening? Where are we getting music or no music? Okay. So I think that was when we first kind of caught wind, and then we found out that in October we were gonna actually do the show. So late summer, early fall is when we started kind of going in to meet with Jacqueline and Justin, and we would do these kind of, I mean, we were already cast. You can't really get rid of us, which I loved. But we did kind of have to do these mini auditions, like these mini vocal auditions. And I'm like, are you going
to gauge how many numbers to give you?
But also, like, are you going to get rid of me? Like, what happens? No, they would never. I think they loved that process. I think that was very fun for them and fun for us. And they made it work for every single character. They found a way to make every single character or every single actor comfortable and shine. And people who would say they can't sing are, number one, liars. And number two, they perform the heck out of these numbers. But yeah, they told us to come in and do, because the whole season is 90s R&B covers. Gosh. They told us to come sing, but they just said come sing a song from the 90s. So I did Bonnie Raitt, Can't Make You Love Me, which is not R&B.
It's not, but it's okay.
I was feeling it. And Chris Bowers was in the room. Emmy winner Chris Bowers was on the piano, and it was really fun. And then we had our entire table reads over Zoom, which was odd, it being our last season. It doesn't hit the same, doing table reads over Zoom, and that final one where you're like, this is the last table read we'll ever have. Okay, leave meeting. Like, it just feels so odd.
Anticlimactic.
Yes, very.
Man, so you were comfortable with, I mean, because obviously, when you were cast as Sam, 5 or so years ago now, singing on camera wasn't part of the job description. How comfortable were you, had you performed musicals in the past, or was singing part of your repertoire already?
I love singing. I grew up doing chorus in middle school and high school, which I was very serious about. And I was very much a goody two shoes in middle school chorus, especially. I had this incredible teacher, Mike Duro, who he basically showed us that he took us on lots of field trips, and he showed us that music can take you places, art can take you places. He did it in a literal way, but I really absorbed it in a figurative sense as well. And it's funny, my little brother he's 13 months younger than me. He joined chorus because he saw that we went on field trips. And then my brother ended up being the one who really was musical and became an opera singer. He plays the piano proficiently. He went to school and got his master's for music, all from school. I think that's my little nod to why it's so important to put art in schools, or keep art in schools. But yeah, I've auditioned for a couple of musicals here in LA before that, and a couple of musical shows, that I've never actually gone far on. I always get get to the callback and then nothing happens. But yeah, that's why I was very excited about already being cast and being able to do this musical. I trained with this wonderful vocal coach who's very old school, which I'm just into older school coaches. I don't know. I rock with the vibe. I think I'm an older soul.
That's great. Well, now you've got some fantastic clips to add to your musical reel. My gosh, I can't wait. I personally hate being spoiled, so I'll ask this final Dear White People question very carefully, which is there something that you can tease that we can look forward to? It can be a number, or a treatment of an issue or whatever that you just had a lot of fun doing that you want to tease to us.
Yeah. So for my cinephiles and my Dear White People fans who've seen season 2, or if you take the time to watch the show and you end up seeing season 2, there's an episode 8, we do a bottle episode, which I had no idea what a bottle episode was before I did it. which is basically a two-hander. It's like a play. It's just two characters stuck in one place for the entire episode. You usually do it for, financial restraints, we also did it for financial restraints. Anyways, Sam and Gabe have this incredible bottle episode in the radio station. So Sam and Gabe also in season 4 have an episode. It's not a full bottle episode, but you do track them because we're going places, but you track them through the episode, and they do have one big number together that is it feels like it's reminiscent of the bottle episode. And that song, I will also tease, is actually not 90s R&B, but it is a very popular song, one I loved as a kid, one you won't know when it starts playing because it's a different arrangement. But once you know what it is, you're going to be like, oh my God.
This is my favorite game. I'm not gonna ask for more, but I'll just ask one. Is the original version of the song a duet?
Boy group.
Oh, it's my favorite game. Okay. I'm not even going to attempt to tease more because I don't want to get spoiled. That's amazing. I love the dynamic between Sam and Gabe. I don't know can I say that I ship them? I mean, I do ship them. But again, I don't know what will happen with them in season 4. So, it's just such a great,
well, that's the exciting part about more. I'm not going to tell you, but the exciting part about season 4 is we're in senior year, but we're also 15 years into the future. So you get to see where all the characters end up. So you get to find out about Sam and Gabe.
Tantalizing. Okay. For my own good, say no more. I will segue to our final 2 questions that we give to every guest. Now I give them to you guys both at once because I realize some people just don't even want to answer the first one, go straight to the second. So 2-part question. First is the Hollywood remixed, which is there a past TV show or a past character or a past movie that, given this week's theme, which is Black college characters or Black college stories, that you would order a do-over for? Usually that means there was something sort of in hindsight that was problematic that you would be I would revise that. Some people have a trouble with that one, which is why I go ahead and give you the second one, which is the hidden gem. Is there something again, same question, is there a story, character, whatever, that you would recommend as I really loved this growing up, or, this character meant a lot to me, or I loved this TV show, that is, again, a Black college character or a Black college set narrative?
Well, you're right. The first question is hard because then you first got to go through the Rolodex of all the, Black collegiate shows, and then you got to go through the Rolodex of the characters, and then you got to decide. Yeah. It's a good question. I'm going to really sip my tea over and think about, because I'm sure it's affected my upbringing. But maybe something will come to me, but if not, I'll move to your second question. And I'm cheating because I think it's actually high school, but it's musical and it's Black, and I feel it's appropriate, and it's Sister Act 2. And I love Sister Act 2 so much because it's kind of, it kind of calls back what I said earlier about the importance of art and music in schools, and that it can take you places. If you want to be somebody, if you want to go somewhere, you got to wake up and make a difference. I love Sister Act 2 so much. I'll watch it anytime it's on. I think they did that film well. And yeah, I think it just showed how overlooked certain groups of people in the world can be. And that if you just give them an opportunity, and if you give them art, that they not only will go places, but they'll make the places you go so much more brilliant. They'll just shine all over the world. Oh my gosh, I'm getting a little existential, but yeah, I can't think if there's any other.
That one, that was legit. Look, anything where, this was anything that is like much of the world's first introduction to Lauryn Hill is going to be like a classic. Like that's I think especially I think maybe for younger people who, didn't grow up with that movie. That's a good recommendation. It's a really good one.
movie.
It's such a good movie. And it ties very nicely into the musical theme of Dear White People season 4. So two birds.
It really does. And it's like it's the right era, it's the right genre, and it's like and actually when you watch season 4 of Dear White People, there's a scene that I think is kind of callback to Sister Act 2, just like the way that it's all set up. So yeah, I won't continue to spoil things.
Oh God. Okay. Well, I guess I hope people listen to this podcast episode, but if you choose to spend your time binge watching all of season 4 of Dear White People, which drops today, I can't blame you. That's probably what I'll be doing. No, I'm not going to binge it. I'm going to parcel it out since it's the last bit of Dear White People that we get. So I'm going to savor it very slowly.
I think binging it in the beginning is okay because it's been a while since you've been away from these characters. And I mean, I love the show, but I do think that when you come back to it, you kind of got to like sit with the episodes. You kind of you got to get into the rhythm. It's like a song. It's like an album. It's like how people used to play vinyl. Like you would just play the whole thing. You wouldn't stop and go, okay, now that I listened to the first 2 songs, I'm going to go do my laundry and you would listen to the whole thing. So I would say get on a roll with Dear White People.
Your musical analogies are so on point. Like you're
God.
Like you're comparing it to a vinyl. Like, okay, yes, I see what you're saying. That's a good point. That absolves me of the guilt of, binging it if that's what I end up doing. But you also, yes, because it is hard to keep track of everything. Like as somebody who, again, like I haven't skipped a single episode of Dear White People, and I was like preparing for this and being like, I completely forgot like entire chunks of it because it has been a while and because there is so much that you guys go through. Well, we can't wait. Thank you so much for the gift of this show and for your performance. It's just been such an amazing world to be immersed in. And so I really loved it. I appreciate it. And I appreciate your time for coming on here today, Logan.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for saying all of those really kind things about the show. I have felt the same way about being on it. So I'm happy we get to share it with the world.
Thanks again to Logan Browning and Evan Nicole Brown for joining us today to reminisce about their college days and talk about the relevance of Black college narratives to so many issues and subjects that we collectively grapple with in off-campus life. The 4th, final, and all-musical season of Dear White People is available on Netflix right now. And if you're like me and can't get enough Dear White People dish, you're in luck because our sibling podcast, TV's Top 5, hosted by my brilliant colleagues Dan Feinberg and Leslie Goldberg, has showrunners Justin Simeon and Jacqueline Moore on their show this Friday. Please stay tuned next week when we talk Hollywood in Hawaii with Doogie Kamealoha showrunner Courtney Kang. And please subscribe to Hollywood Remixed on the podcast platform of your choice so that you don't miss it. Until then, aloha.